And we are slowly but safely approaching the end of our international stage. We have 2 more exciting slots left, so please don't go away right away. But did you know that we have our own agenda on Swapcard and that we have more international and more exciting stages coming up? And that's why I want to give you some insights on what's happening on the other stages. If you haven't had a chance to check them out, I can highly recommend doing that. We have the eIDAS in practice stage, where we'll have a talk on use cases from the university hospital and on digital patient signatures. This will be the last slot on the eIDAS in practice stage. We also do have another stage. It's the digital identity stage, where 10 minutes after 1, we have the last expert council on the digital identity ecosystem. So also a really interesting topic. Feel free to pop in, ask questions and engage with the audience. And of course, we do have our main stage moderated by my colleague Rebecca. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this stage. There are following up talks on e-signatures in the automotive industry. There's a panel and input talk on comparing cloud and on-premise solutions. And there's also later today a talk and a panel on digital identities and digital identifications in and from Germany. And for all of you who are joining the international stage because you want to have some English inputs, there's also another English talk happening on our main stage at 2:45. It's about digital identity. It's on learnings and inspirations from our European Union's friends. And we have 3 exciting companies and representatives from these companies on this panel. We have France Connect, we have Namirial, and we have It's Me. So if you're looking for another English-speaking panel, feel free to check out the main stage at 2:45. And as I already mentioned, you can create your own agenda on Swapcard. So if you want to pre-select your slots, feel free to do that. And then everything is right on your screen when we start our panels. And again, you can already see that in the background. Feel free to use this conference as a networking opportunity. I already checked out some really inspiring discussions going on Twitter. So if you want to be part of that discussion, use our hashtag eIDAS21. If you want to connect with the audience, connect with the speakers, also feel free to do that on Swapcard and later on LinkedIn and other collaboration conference formats. And again, for this conference, feel free to use the chat, which you will see on the right-hand side of your screen. Ask questions not only to the speakers, but also use this as a discussion format and participate and connect among the audience. And having said that, it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker and the last country use case we have on the stage. It's from Sweden, and it's said really that the eIDAS regulation creates one single framework for eID and trust services to make it more straightforward to deliver services across the European Union. But however, a digital single market enabled by eIDAS is still far from becoming reality. Why is this the case? Well, the next presentation will highlight local legislators offering approaches to the eIDAS electronic signature framework and how potential legislative hurdles could affect digitalization initiatives on both local and pan-European businesses. And for that, it's a pleasure, you can already see him here on screen, to welcome Peter Karlstedt from Scrive. He's a business lawyer with a solid background in managing and resolving complex legal, commercial and technical aspects in business negotiations. And as the chief legal officer at Scrive, his main mission is to help Scrive's client to overcome these before mentioned legal blocking points in their digitalization journey. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm really happy to be here, and I will start with sharing my screen, and so that you can all view the presentation. And let me just ensure that it's in presentation mode. So, do you see the presentation? I hope so. Great. As said, my name is Peter Karlstedt, Chief Legal Officer at Scrive, and Scrive is a leading provider of electronic signature solutions and eID services. We are headquartered in Stockholm, but we have local representations in countries throughout Europe, including Germany, Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark. And the topic, again, is about challenges or opportunities for digitalization based on the local implementation of the eIDAS principles. And let me see. So before I start, I would like to mention a few more words about Scribe. So we do have customers in almost 40 countries throughout Europe and outside Europe. We also have customers that operate in all types of business segments, and they use our services for all types of business transactions, whether it's employment contracts by an HR department or purchasing department, and supplier agreements, B2B sales, retail scenarios, etc., etc. So we have quite a lot of hands-on experience working with our customers to understand their challenges and the opportunities they have to digitalize business processes. And many of our customers on the enterprise level have multinational presence and operations. And if you are working with a digitalization initiative or a project on a multi-country level, you will quite soon find that what works in one country may not actually work in another country. Not due to eIDAS, actually, but due to other factors. And this is kind of the angle for this presentation. I will not talk that much about electronic identity, eIDAS revisions, or things like that. My focus is on how to enable digital onboarding processes, signing contracts with your suppliers, your customers, your new employees, etc. And of course, if you look in general for digitalization of business processes, there are a lot of challenges and a lot of things that I won't really cover in this presentation. The main angle, as said, is regards to the complexity of laws and regulations. And if you look at the legal aspects, it's actually one of the first questions that come to mind when you start this kind of project. So you realize that you have a process where you need to interact with another party, and you want that interaction to be managed electronically all the way from document creation and initiation to the point where you can archive and process the information in your internal business systems. And the prerequisite for this to happen is that you can actually use electronic signatures and that you can use it in a convenient way so that your counterpart has the ability to sign and can trust the solution. Questions that arise are are electronic signatures applicable or legally binding? What type of electronic signature should we use? You're all aware of the different levels that the eIDAS recognizes: the simple electronic signature level, the advanced electronic signature, and the qualified electronic signature. But people in general, and not the least business lawyers and corporate lawyers, may not really have a good understanding of what the differences are. And then you add the question of whether you should use a qualified trust service provider or not. And thing is, there are rarely any simple yes or no answers to these types of questions. You need to make an assessment. And to start with, you need to understand the baseline. So the basic criteria for using electronic signatures at all is that you look at contract law, because this is a civil law criteria or a civil law concept, a signature. A signature is something that you place on a document, for example, to signify your intent to be bound by the conditions in the contract that you're signing. If you have the intent to be bound by the contract, you have a binding contract irrespective of how the contract is formed, because contract law also allows for freedom of form. Contracts do not need to be signed to be valid and binding. You can agree orally, you can shake hands, you can dance around the flagpole. However you do it, if your intention is to be bound by this contract and it's clear to the parties that this was the case, you can still enforce the contract. And with regards to enforcement, the important factor here is, of course, that a court will not dismiss the use of electronic documentation, electronic signatures, and say, well, we need to see paper evidence. And this is, of course, something that you think should be an obvious factor. But eIDAS puts this in writing and makes this mandatory all throughout the European Union, just to ensure that a court may not dismiss electronic signatures and electronic evidence. So the baseline is pretty clear. As long as you have a good context, the experience, user experience is clear so that you understand that you're signing, and the contract that you're signing is not subject to any type of restrictions, then you can use whatever type of electronic signature you would like. If the context is unclear, like in the example to your below right, it's not a signature. When it says, I have read and understood, and it says click next, that is not the signature because it doesn't fulfill the requirement of ensuring that the signatory had intent to sign. The circumstances are not that specific. But then there are complicating factors, and you can ask yourself, what's the actual complexity then if this baseline is so simple? Well, eIDAS has a concept of special legal effect. It's not really mentioned in the eIDAS regulation as such, but there is a wording about qualified electronic signatures having the equivalent legal effect of a handwritten signature. And this concept is unfortunately quite often subject to misunderstandings or misconceptions. A very common mistake is that even by legal, corporate legal or other persons with legal training is to understand this as well. The current practice of using handwritten signatures in the analog world, where we use paper contracts, should be replaced by the use of qualified electronic signature, because that equals a handwritten signature. Well, in fact, you can replace current practice with handwritten signatures as long as it's a practice with any type of electronic signature, and it's still legal and valid and binding. The aspect of the special legal effect is that if you sign with a qualified electronic signature and you go to court because of a dispute, then the court can apply a presumption that the signature is valid and that the signatory was identified. So there's a procedural aspect to this that is the actual meaning of the eIDAS regulation. And that's something that you have to bear in mind. It may be just a nice to have or something that's important to you, but you should also be aware that in local regulations in some countries in Europe, the same special legal effect have been applied already on the advanced electronic signature level. So in that context, you don't actually need to use a qualified signature to reach the same effect. The second aspect is that statutory requirement on written form may apply. Statutory requirements on a specific form are quite common. And the most common one is a requirement for written form. In most countries in Europe, this basically means that as long as you have reduced that type of documentation or to writing, it doesn't matter what the format is. It doesn't matter whether it's in an email, on a paper, or some electronic record. it's still written form. But in a few countries in Europe, there's an additional requirement that in order to comply with the statutory requirements on written form, you need to sign the document. And this applies in the DACH region and Poland and Italy. In the rest of Europe, there is no such specific requirement, which makes things much more easy and simple, actually. But in those countries where this applies, the legislator has also decided whether you can comply with this requirement by signing with a simple, advanced, or qualified electronic signatures. And in the DACH region and Poland, the determination was qualified electronic signature. So as soon as the law says written form or Schriftform in German, you need to use a qualified electronic signature. In Italy, the advanced level has been deemed sufficient for the same purpose. And then, of course, you have exceptions where the legislation or practice says that you basically can't use electronic signatures. If a document has to be notarized when it's signed, it's not maybe yet possible to use electronic signature solutions. And there are examples of separate or specific types of documents where the legislator says, we don't think you should be able to use electronic signatures at all, basically. So a business that do want to digitalize business processes, and you may have numerous types of documents that you want to digitize, you need to make kind of a matrix to determine what a type of electronic signature should I actually use, or may I use, or may I be required to use. And again, if you look at contract law, green light everywhere. You can use whichever type you want. eIDAS, same thing. eIDAS recognizes the legal effect of all three levels, and all three levels are indeed admissible as evidence in court. Where you find the problems is basically where it gets more complex is where you have this aspect that the law says written form signature is required. A typical example of this is where GDPR says that a notice or an incident report to the supervisory authority shall be in writing. In most countries in Europe, you can comply with that by sending an email to the supervisory authority. But in Germany, for example, if you want to comply with that requirement using an electronic signature and send in the documentation in electronic format, you need to apply a qualified electronic signature. So quite much more of a hurdle. And then again, the exceptions. If it's a red mark here, then it's a no-go in any event. Doesn't matter which level, basically. If you're representing a bank or financial institution, you have additional requirements to consider. Namely the anti-money laundering or know your customer requirements. And there are the way I see it, there are two approaches to this from the local regulators. As you know, these requirements are put forward in an EU directive, which are then translated into local law and regulations. And in some countries, the Financial Supervisory Authority will look for use of strong authentication. So then you need to find a solution for a strong authentication that you can combine with your electronic signature solution in order to comply with the additional AML KYC requirements. The other alternative is that you refer explicitly to advanced or qualified electronic signatures, the same terminology that eIDAS uses. And lastly, you need to consider your business risk. And I want to show a quick example of a best practice example that complies both with local regulations for electronic signatures and KYC requirements. So that was a solution that is perfectly compliant from a legislation perspective, but also extremely user-friendly. Because this is something that you need to consider. You could think that the qualified electronic signature is the obvious choice, but you need to look at other determining factors. You need to look at time to market, implementation cost, transaction cost, not the least the user experience, and of course, available solutions on the market. So CES, or the qualified electronic signature, isn't really the obvious choice unless the local regulations basically makes it mandatory. For other scenarios, the business should make a full assessment. First of all, the legal and risk assessment, then also whether or not you will find a solution that will work and that your customers will accept to use. So in summary, then this is my last slide, it is a challenge to navigate the legal landscape because the local regulations differs from one country to another. And in my view, and I'm kind of challenging maybe the common idea here, but the local statutory requirements and actually an unnecessary focus on qualified electronic signatures may become or be a major hurdle for digitalization already today. And coming from the Nordic market and the environment where people and businesses are using electronic signature at a very high level. It's actually more common, I think, to use electronic signatures than to sign on paper today in the Nordic countries. And I believe strongly that the simplification of statutory requirements and a successful eID implementation is the Nordic recipe for success. That was it. Thank you. I hope I kept the time.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was on point. So thanks for sharing your insights and for being with us today on our eIDAS Summit.